Good morning, my dears. I hope this day finds you well wherever you may be, whether you're waking up to a quiet morning or sipping your coffee in the comfort of your favorite chair. I want to thank you for joining me here today. My name is Lily Matthews, and I'm 74 years old. I've lived a life full of both sweetness and sorrow, but today I'd like to share a story with you. A story that has been buried deep within my heart for so long, one that I never thought I would tell. It's a journey of survival, of loss, and of finding hope in the darkest of times. I'm speaking to you from the quiet corner of my living room in Portland, Oregon, a place I've called home for many years now. This town, with its cool mornings and rainy afternoons, has become my refuge, but it hasn't always been that way. My life hasn't always been peaceful. There was a time many years ago when the world I knew was shattered in an instant, and everything I thought I understood about love, trust, and family was turned upside down. You see, my story is not a fairy tale. It's not about a girl who was saved by a prince or a dream that came true. No, this story is about the courage to stand up when everything you've known falls apart. It's about finding your strength when it feels like the world is working against you. And it's about realizing through pain and hardship that sometimes the greatest battles we face are not fought with fists or weapons, but with our hearts, our minds, and our will to survive. Before I begin, I want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you. This channel has reached 50,000 subscribers in the past month, and I can't help but be overwhelmed with gratitude. Your support means more to me than words can express. It gives me the courage to speak about things I never thought I would, things that still hurt even after all these years. But your kind words, your comments, your messages, they remind me that we're never truly alone, even in our most difficult times. So, if you're watching this today, I invite you to sit back, relax, and listen. This story is as much yours as it is mine. I believe there is something in it that can speak to all of us. Maybe you've experienced loss, maybe you've faced a battle that seemed impossible, or maybe you've been through something that no one can ever truly understand but you. Whatever it is, I hope that by sharing my journey, you will find a bit of comfort, a bit of understanding, or even just the hope that it's possible to come through the storm. My journey began in a small town outside of Portland, a place where life was simple and straightforward. I grew up in a house that smelled of fresh-baked bread, where my mother's hands were always busy making something. Whether it was a quilt, a loaf of bread, or a warm, comforting meal. My father was a truck driver, gone on the road for days at a time, but when he was home, he was the anchor of our family. The man who would tell stories of his travels, who would fix anything that needed fixing, and who made me feel like nothing in this world could hurt me. I had two older brothers, and though they were often busy with their own lives, I always felt safe in the love and stability of my family. But like all things in life, that stability was fragile. It was in 1963, when I was 17, that things started to change. When I first began to see the cracks in the foundation of our home, the first signs that the love I had once taken for granted was not as unbreakable as I thought. It wasn't a dramatic event, no single moment that I could point to and say, that was when everything shifted. No, it was more like a slow fade, a quiet unraveling that took place over the course of several years. And by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late to stop. The man I married, Julian Matthews, was my rock. He was charming, ambitious, and driven. Everything I had dreamed of in a partner. We met when I was 19, working in the fabric shop my father had run for years. Julian had this magnetic presence that made everyone pay attention when he walked into a room. He knew how to make people feel important, how to say just the right thing at the right time. He swept me off my feet with his confidence and his kind gestures. He treated me like a queen, bringing me flowers, taking me out on dates, and writing me little notes that I kept hidden away in my Bible. But, as you'll soon learn, things were not always as they seemed. Over time, as we married and built a life together, the cracks that had first appeared in my family began to show up in my marriage. I didn't notice them at first because when you're in love, it's easy to overlook the small signs. But soon enough, Julian's demands started to feel like suffocating rules. His words began to feel like chains, and the man I had fallen in love with was slowly being replaced by someone I could no longer recognize. But this is where my story takes a darker turn. The man I thought I knew, the man I had trusted for over 30 years, began to change before my very eyes. And just like that, the life I had worked so hard to build started crumbling around me. It was no longer a matter of simple misunderstandings or minor disagreements. It became a matter of survival. I'm sure some of you may be wondering, why didn't you leave? Why didn't you speak up? I've asked myself the same questions many times. But when you're caught in a web of lies and manipulation, when the person you love turns into someone you fear, it's not always so easy to walk away. It's not always so clear-cut, but it was in the darkest moments, in the quietest whispers of doubt, that I found my strength. And that, my friends, is where this journey truly begins. I want to thank you for being here, for taking the time to listen to my story. I hope that by sharing it, you will come to see that no matter how much pain we endure, no matter how many times we are knocked down, there is always a way to stand up again. This is my story, but it is also yours, and I believe we can all find something in it that speaks to our own struggles, our own triumphs, and our own path to healing. Let's begin this journey together. Growing up in Portland, Oregon during the 1950s, life was much simpler than it is today. I remember a time when the days seemed to stretch on endlessly, with nothing more pressing than what was for dinner or what book I'd borrow from the library. It wasn't a life of luxury or excitement, but it was a life full of warmth, community, and a sense of safety that seems so rare in today's world. Our home was a modest one, nothing grand by any means, but it was ours. It sat on the edge of Selwood, a neighborhood that was just starting to blossom into the vibrant community it would later become. I was the middle child of 5 siblings, 3 girls and 2 boys, and we all had our roles, our responsibilities, and our favorite places to hide away when the house got too noisy. Being the middle child often meant I had to figure out my place in the world, to carve out a space for myself amidst my older and younger siblings. But it also meant that I wasn't the center of attention, which, to be honest, suited me just fine. I was always more content to listen and observe, soaking in the little details of life around me. My parents, George and Agnes, did their best to provide for us. My father worked long hours at the fabric store downtown. It wasn't an exciting job, but it was steady work, and it kept food on the table and clothes on our backs. My mother, who had grown up on a farm in the rolling hills of Oregon, was a practical woman, who knew how to stretch a dollar and make a meal out of whatever we had in the pantry. I can still remember her hands, strong and weathered from years of work, whether she was sewing clothes, making bread, or gardening in the backyard. There was a certain comfort in the rhythm of her work, in the way she moved through the house, never rushing but always busy, always with a purpose. Our backyard was a small patch of earth, but it felt like a kingdom to me. There, my mother planted everything from tomatoes to green beans, even a small strawberry patch that I tended to with more enthusiasm than skill. The strawberries were always my favorite. I can still taste the sweetness of those early summer mornings when I picked the ripe, red fruit, wiping the dirt from my hands as I eagerly took a bite. My father, when he was home, would sit on the back steps, smoking his pipe and watching us with a contented look on his face. Those moments were the heart of our family, simple, quiet, and filled with love. School was a place I looked forward to, not just because I loved learning, but because it was where I could escape the confines of home, where I could be just Lily. I walked to Selwood Elementary every day, my lunchbox clutched in my hand, the sounds of the neighborhood waking up around me. We didn't have much, but we never went without. My uniform, a neat navy blue skirt and white blouse, was always pressed and clean, just like my mother taught me. She had a way of making even the simplest things feel important. She taught me how to iron my clothes, to fold the towels just so, to always say please and thank you. Little things that, looking back now, seem so trivial but were the foundation of who I became. The teachers at Selwood were strict but fair, and I excelled in my studies. I remember my teacher, Mrs. Dalton, who taught us reading and math, would always call me to the front to demonstrate something I had done well. It wasn't about competition, it was about community. She would praise everyone for their effort, and in turn we all helped each other. There was no rush, no pressure to be perfect. We did our best and that was enough. But even in the quietest of times, there were signs that life wasn't always as perfect as it seemed. My older brother Daniel was already in high school when I was in elementary, and I could sense the distance growing between him and the family. He was always so serious, always so focused on his own ambitions, and he started spending more time away from home. My younger siblings, Tim and Sarah, were still too young to understand much about the world beyond the yard. But they were my joy, my companions in games and mischief. Though I was happy with my family, there were moments when I wanted more. I had dreams that went beyond the walls of our little house and our small neighborhood. I remember sitting at the kitchen table one night, listening to my parents discuss the day's events, when I blurted out that I wanted to be a teacher. My father laughed softly and said, "A teacher, huh? Well, if that's what you want, I believe you'll do it, Lily." It wasn't much of a response, but it meant everything to me at that moment. It was the first time I realized that my dreams, no matter how small they seemed, mattered. At the time, I didn't know what I was capable of. I didn't understand that dreams require hard work, sacrifice, and sometimes, the courage to challenge everything you've been taught. But back then, I didn't have to think about that. I was a child and the world was still simple, still full of possibilities. One of my fondest memories is of the 4th of July celebrations in Selwood. The streets would be lined with vendors selling all sorts of treats, and the air would be thick with the scent of popcorn and roasting corn on the cob. Families gathered in the park for the square dance, where people of all ages would join in, laughing, spinning, and calling out to one another. I remember wearing a simple gingham dress, my hair tied back in a ribbon, and spinning around the dance floor, laughing with friends as the music played on. Those were the days when all that mattered was the present, when joy was something simple and immediate. But like all good things, my childhood eventually came to an end. It didn't happen all at once, but gradually. The simplicity of life began to fade as I got older. I saw the world outside of Selwood, the city of Portland expanding, changing, growing in ways I hadn't expected. And with those changes, I started to realize that there was more to life than what I had known. The world was bigger, more complicated, and the things I had taken for granted were slipping away faster than I could hold on to them. Still, when I look back on those years, I remember them with warmth. The simplicity of our life in Selwood was, in its own way, a treasure. It was a time when I didn't yet know the hardships that awaited me, when I could still hold on to the innocence of childhood and dream of a future that seemed just out of reach. It's those moments, those quiet, everyday moments, that shaped me into the person I would become, and that's what I carry with me today. In the end, it was that simplicity that taught me the most important lesson of all. Life is fragile. But even in its fragility, it is full of moments worth holding on to. And those moments, those little pieces of happiness and love, are the ones that carry us through the hardest times. The first time I noticed something was wrong with my father, I couldn't put my finger on it. I was only 12 at the time, and the world still felt like a place of simple pleasures. But the changes were subtle, as changes often are. It was more of a feeling than a concrete shift, like the air suddenly feeling a little too cold, or the sunlight not as warm as it once had been. Everything seemed fine on the surface, but I knew deep down something was off. My father, George Matthews, had always been the steady anchor in our family. He was a man of routine, of discipline, and of quiet strength. He worked long hours at the local hardware store, but he always made time for us, his children. Every Sunday after church, he would take us to the park, where we'd play games of catch or kick the soccer ball around. I loved those moments with him, his deep laughter, the way he'd cheer for every goal, no matter how small. He had a way of making us feel like we were the most important people in the world. But then it started to change. It was a slow progression, one I couldn't fully grasp at the time. I remember the first sign vividly. It was a cold fall evening, just as the days were beginning to shorten. My father had returned from work, but instead of his usual jovial self, he was quiet, distant. At dinner that night, he hardly said a word. I glanced at my mother and I saw it too, the worry in her eyes, the way she kept glancing at him when she thought he wasn't looking. But she never said anything. We didn't talk about things like that in our family. We were the kind of family that swept problems under the rug, pretending they weren't there. So we all ate in silence, passing the mashed potatoes and green beans, the only sounds the clink of silverware on china. The next few days followed the same pattern. My father would come home from work, barely acknowledging us. I noticed that his temper, which had always been mild, was growing shorter. When my younger brother Tim spilled juice on the kitchen table one afternoon, I was shocked to hear my father snap at him. "Why can't you be more careful, Tim?" he barked, his voice sharp and uncharacteristic. Tim, usually the one who could do no wrong in my father's eyes, just stood there, frozen, eyes wide in confusion. My mother looked up from her knitting, but didn't say anything. Neither did I. It wasn't the kind of thing we talked about. At night, when we'd gather around the TV to watch our favorite shows, my father would sit in his chair, his gaze fixed but unfocused. He didn't laugh at the jokes, didn't join in on the family conversations. I started to notice other things too, little things. He stopped fixing things around the house. There was a leaky faucet in the kitchen that had been dripping for days, but when I asked him if he'd take a look at it, he just waved it off. "I'll get to it," he said, but he didn't. Then there was the garage, which had always been his domain. It was always tidy with every tool in its place, but now it was cluttered with boxes and things piled up in disarray. My father was a man who thrived on order, so to see the mess was like watching him lose his grip on something vital. It wasn't just the physical changes, it was the emotional ones too. There was a growing distance between us. I could no longer talk to my father like I used to. I missed the nights when he'd sit at the kitchen table and tell us stories from when he was young. He'd talk about the farm he grew up on, about the pranks he and his siblings used to pull, about the trouble he'd gotten into with his best friend, Earl. He had a way of making even the mundane feel magical. But now those stories had stopped. When I tried to bring them up, he'd give me a quick, distracted answer and then change the subject. One day, after weeks of this unsettling silence, my mother and I were in the kitchen when she finally spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "I think your father's drinking again." I paused, my hands frozen in the act of drying a dish. I had always known that my father had a tendency to drink when things got tough, but it had never been a problem, at least not one I'd noticed. My mother's words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think that the man who had always been the backbone of our family could be slipping into something so dangerous. That night I stayed up late, lying in bed, listening for the telltale sounds. The clink of bottles, the slow, deliberate shuffle of his steps as he made his way back to the living room. The hours stretched on endlessly, and I could hear my mother's quiet sobs through the thin walls. I wanted to go to her to comfort her, but I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to fix it. This wasn't something we knew how to handle in our house. We were supposed to be strong, to handle our problems in silence, to never let anyone see the cracks in our family. But the cracks were there, and they were getting bigger. The next morning, my father was quieter than usual. He hadn't gone to work that day, and I knew something was wrong. But instead of confronting him, I stayed away. I didn't know what to say, how to ask him what was going on. It wasn't until later, when I walked past the living room, that I saw the empty bottle on the coffee table. My heart sank. It was clear now. My father had been drinking again, and this time it wasn't just a one-time slip. Something had shifted in him, and I wasn't sure if I could fix it. As the weeks went on, the pattern only deepened. My father's behavior grew more erratic, more unpredictable. Some days he would be distant, locked in his own world, and other days he would lash out over the smallest things. I remember one Sunday afternoon, when I was helping my mother in the garden, and my father came outside and started yelling at her over something as insignificant as the placement of a flower pot. I was shocked. My mother, always so composed, just stood there, her face pale, saying nothing. And for the first time I saw a crack in her armor. The man I had always looked up to, the man who had been my protector, was now a shadow of himself. I didn't know how to deal with the change. I didn't know how to confront it. But I couldn't deny it anymore. My father was changing, and with him, everything around us was shifting too. I couldn't explain it in a way that made sense, not even to myself. But I knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning of something I was too young to fully understand, something that would change the course of my life forever. Looking back now, I realize that those first signs, the small shifts in behavior, the sudden outbursts, the subtle distancing, were the beginning of a much larger story. A story of a man struggling with his own demons. A story that would unfold in ways I couldn't have imagined. But at the time, all I could do was watch, helpless, as the man who had always been my hero started to slip away, little by little. And that feeling of helplessness, that feeling of not knowing how to stop the inevitable, is something that has stayed with me ever since. The first violation is always the hardest. It's the one that shakes you to your core, the one that changes how you see the world. For me, it came when I was just a teenager. And it was from someone I loved and trusted more than anyone else, my father. The man who had always been my protector, the one who taught me to ride a bike and held my hand when I was scared, was no longer the person I thought he was. The realization didn't come in an instant. It came slowly, piece by piece, like a puzzle that started to form a picture I didn't want to see. It was the summer of 1968, and I was 14 years old. The days stretched long and hot, filled with the smell of fresh-cut grass and the sound of crickets chirping late into the night. I remember the warmth of the sun on my skin and the endless hours I spent outside, playing with my friends or helping my mother in the garden. Life seemed simple, full of innocent joys. But there was a subtle shift in the air, a change I couldn't quite explain. It had started with my father's temper. It wasn't like him to raise his voice, but more and more I found myself walking on eggshells trying to avoid setting him off. Little things would trigger him, things that never used to matter, like a misplaced tool or a dinner that wasn't prepared to his liking. I thought it was just stress from work, that maybe he was just tired, but there was something darker in his eyes. I could see it even when he tried to hide it. I remember one evening, the first time I really felt the weight of the change. My father had been quiet all day, lost in his thoughts. It was a Saturday, and we were all gathered around the dinner table, just the four of us, my mother, my two brothers, and me. The food was simple as it usually was. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. We were talking about the plans for the upcoming weekend when my father suddenly stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I can't take this anymore," he muttered, almost to himself but loud enough for us all to hear. His voice was strained, like a rubber band stretched too tight. "I need some time alone." And with that, he left the room, slamming the door behind him. My mother and I exchanged a worried glance. We knew something was wrong, but neither of us knew how to fix it. My brothers were quiet too, sensing the tension in the air. For the rest of the evening we ate in silence, the once familiar sounds of our family dinners now replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. My mother didn't say anything about my father's outburst. She never did. She just cleared the table as if nothing had happened, and went about her business pretending to be fine. But I could see the worry in her eyes. I knew she was just as scared as I was. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling, and wondering where my father had gone. It wasn't like him to leave without saying anything. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't long before I heard the creak of the door to my room, followed by the soft sound of footsteps. My heart started to race as I tried to make sense of the situation. It was my father, standing in the doorway, his face shadowed in the dim light. "I need to talk to you, Lily," he said, his voice low and uncertain. He stepped into my room, closing the door quietly behind him. "Dad, what's going on?" I asked, sitting up in bed, my mind racing. I was afraid, but I didn't know why. I had never been afraid of my father before. I don't know anymore. "I don't know what's happening to me," he murmured, his voice breaking. He sat down on the edge of my bed, his hands trembling. "I don't know how to fix it." His words hung in the air like a heavy weight. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay. But I didn't know how. This wasn't the father I knew. The man who had always been strong and steady was now unraveling in front of me, and I didn't know what to do. He looked at me, his eyes red, his gaze distant. And then in that moment something shifted. He reached out, his hand brushing against my cheek, and I froze. It was a small gesture, but it felt wrong. The warmth of his touch felt foreign, as if I didn't know him anymore. The hand that had once comforted me now made me feel like I was trapped, like I couldn't escape. "Lily," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to hurt you, but I don't know how to stop. I don't know what's happening to me." I stared at him, trying to understand. I wanted to believe him, to believe that this was just a moment of weakness, that he wasn't capable of doing anything wrong. But deep down I knew something was different. The father I had always known, the one who had kissed my scraped knees, who had held me when I was scared, was slipping away, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. And for the first time in my life I was scared of him. "I'm scared, Dad," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know what's happening to you, but this isn't you. This isn't the father I know." He didn't respond at first. Instead, he just sat there, his head bowed, as if the weight of his own actions was too much for him to bear. Then he reached out again, his hand shaking as it came close to my face. But this time I pulled away. I didn't want his touch anymore. I didn't want him to get any closer. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I never meant for it to be like this. I never wanted to hurt you." But the damage had already been done. The trust that had taken years to build had been shattered in that moment. The man I had trusted above all else had violated that trust in the most profound way possible. And as I lay in my bed that night, my heart heavy with fear and confusion, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The first violation is always the hardest. It's the moment when innocence is lost, when the world you thought you understood starts to crumble. For me, it was in that room in the quiet of the night, when I realized that my father, the person I loved most in the world, had become someone I feared. It was a loss I couldn't explain, a wound that would take years to heal. In the days that followed, my father's behavior only worsened. The kind, loving man I had known was now a stranger, his actions more erratic and unpredictable. And I, caught between fear and loyalty, didn't know how to navigate this new world we were living in. What had once felt like safety, like love, now felt like a prison. But I didn't have the words to speak it. I didn't have the courage to confront him, to tell him how deeply his actions had hurt me. I kept it all inside, buried beneath a facade of normalcy, pretending that everything was fine, even when my world was falling apart. And in doing so, I unknowingly began to break myself piece by piece just to survive. That was the first violation. But it wouldn't be the last. And little did I know, this was only the beginning of a much darker journey, one that would take me far from the girl I had once been. Living in silence is an experience that stays with you, even when the words are long gone. It's not just the absence of sound. It's the heaviness that fills the space between you and the world, a weight that settles deep in your chest, pressing down with every breath. I learned to live in that silence, to hold the lies close to my heart, as if they were the only things keeping me from falling apart. After that night, when my father's behavior took a darker turn, things changed between us. He became a stranger to me, someone I didn't know or trust. But no one could know what had happened. No one could understand the truth, not without shattering the illusion we had carefully built over the years. And so I said nothing. For weeks, the silence stretched on. At home, my father continued his unpredictable behavior. Some days he was the man I had known and loved, kind, gentle, and full of care. Other days he was a different person altogether. A man filled with anger and frustration that seemed to come from nowhere. His moods were like storms, unpredictable and fierce, and I never knew when the next one would hit. But what hurt more than anything was the silence that followed. The unspoken understanding between us that we would pretend everything was fine. I remember a specific moment that sticks with me to this day. It was a Sunday afternoon, and my mother was busy preparing a meal for the family, as she always did. My brothers and I were sitting around the kitchen table, talking about nothing in particular when my father came in. He looked at me for a moment, his eyes scanning my face as if searching for something, but I quickly looked away, hoping he wouldn't notice the fear in my eyes. For a moment he said nothing. He just stood there, his eyes lingering on me, and I could feel the weight of everything unsaid between us. The lie that hung between us like a thick fog. Then finally he spoke, his voice low and cautious. "Everything okay, Lily?" he asked, his tone barely above a whisper. I nodded, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Yes, Dad. Everything's fine." But nothing was fine. Nothing had been fine since that night, and the weight of that unspoken truth pressed down on me with every passing day. I couldn't tell him what I had learned, what I had felt in those moments when the father I loved became someone I feared. I couldn't tell him that his touch had made my skin crawl, that his words had broken something inside me that could never be repaired. Instead, I kept the silence. I locked it away in the deepest part of myself where no one could see it. And in doing so, I began to lose myself. The girl who once laughed freely, who sang along to the radio as she cleaned the house, was now a shadow of who she had been. I stopped speaking to my friends about anything that mattered. I stopped telling my mother how I felt, pretending everything was normal when it felt anything but. At school I became distant. My grades started to slip, and my once bright and lively personality faded into something quieter, more reserved. Teachers noticed, of course. Mrs. Dawson, my English teacher, pulled me aside one day after class and asked if everything was okay. I remember the kindness in her eyes as she asked, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything. The lie that I had woven into my everyday life was so tightly bound, so deeply embedded, that even someone who cared couldn't break through. "I'm fine, Mrs. Dawson," I said, the words falling out without thinking. Just a little tired, that's all. She nodded, but there was something in her expression that told me she didn't believe me. It was the way her brow furrowed just slightly, the way she hesitated before walking away. I knew she was concerned, but I also knew that I couldn't share the truth with her. I couldn't risk breaking the silence. And so, I kept living in the quiet. At home, I pretended that nothing had changed. I smiled when my mother asked how my day was. I helped around the house, made dinner, and did my chores without complaint. But every day, the weight of the lie grew heavier. Every smile I forced, every laugh I pretended, felt like a burden. And the guilt of not telling my mother what had really happened. The guilt of keeping the secret from her, gnawed at me like a constant ache. The lies became my protection, I told myself. If I didn't tell anyone, if I kept everything inside, I could keep my family safe. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. The silence wasn't protecting anyone. It was suffocating me. It was turning me into someone I didn't recognize. Then came the small moments that hinted at the truth being harder to keep buried. One afternoon, I was in the living room reading a book when my father came in. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching me without speaking. I felt the same tension in the air that I always did when he was around, like he was waiting for something, like he wanted to say something but couldn't bring himself to. Finally, he spoke. "Lily," he said, his voice strained. "I know things haven't been easy lately, but I want you to know that I love you. No matter what happens, I love you." His words hit me harder than I expected. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to tell him everything, to scream at him, to tell him how much he had hurt me. But the silence had been so deeply ingrained in me that I couldn't break it. The lies had become too comfortable, too familiar. They had kept me safe, or at least that's what I thought. They were the walls I had built to protect myself, but they had become a prison. "I love you too, Dad," I said, my voice barely a whisper, as I looked down at my book to avoid his gaze. And in that moment I realized how much I had lost. The trust one had once placed in my father had shattered into a million pieces, but I couldn't bring myself to face it. The silence between us was both a shield and a weapon, keeping the truth at bay while slowly destroying me from the inside. It was in those moments, sitting in the quiet of our home, that I started to understand something crucial. Living in silence, hiding behind lies, was not the way to protect myself. It was the way to lose myself entirely. But I didn't know how to escape. I didn't know how to break free from the silence that had become my reality. The weight of lies, I realized, is far heavier than the burden of truth. And though I didn't know it at the time, the truth was the only thing that could set me free. There are moments in life when the weight of all the unsaid words, the silent suffering, and the built-up tension finally become too much to carry. It's like a dam that has been holding back a river for far too long. One small crack is all it takes, and suddenly everything comes rushing out. For me, that moment came one cold December evening, when the silence I had been living with for so long finally broke wide open. It had been months since that first sign of trouble, when my father's behavior shifted, and I started noticing the darkness that had taken over him. For weeks, I kept pretending everything was fine, keeping up the facade for my mother, for my brothers, and even for myself. I told myself that if I just ignored it, if I kept the lie alive long enough, things would eventually get back to normal. But the weight of it all was starting to crush me. The small, almost imperceptible signs of change in my father, his sudden bursts of anger, his cold silences, his unpredictability, had been building, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. And in the quiet of our home, I began to feel the suffocating pressure of it all. It started as a small argument like so many others before. We were sitting around the dinner table, my mother, my father, and me. My brothers had already gone out for the evening, leaving just the three of us to share a meal in silence. It was the usual uneventful dinner. Mashed potatoes, green beans, and the roast my mother had prepared with so much care. But I felt a heaviness in the air, a tension that didn't belong at our family table. My father sat across from me, his eyes fixed on his plate, his fork moving mechanically through his food. My mother was quietly talking about her day at work, but I could tell that even she felt the unease. She kept glancing at my father, as if waiting for him to speak, but he didn't. There was a coldness in his silence that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't the comfortable quiet that often accompanied our meals. This was something different, something heavy. Finally, my father put down his fork and looked at me. It wasn't the loving gaze I remembered, the one that used to make me feel safe. No, this was something darker. His eyes were hard, cold, like the man I had seen glimpses of in the past few months. I could feel my heart race, my hands begin to tremble under the table. I knew something was coming, but I couldn't anticipate just how bad it would get. Are you going to tell me what's really going on, Lily? His voice was low but sharp, the words cutting through the air like a knife. You've been acting strange lately. You're not the same girl I raised. I froze. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? How could I possibly explain everything that had been happening? Everything I had been keeping hidden for so long. The truth, the awful, unbearable truth, was something I couldn't bring myself to face, let alone share with him. Instead, I looked down at my plate, hoping the moment would pass, hoping he'd drop it and we could go back to pretending. But he didn't let it go. His voice rose just a little, and I could feel the tension in his words. Don't look away from me, Lily. I'm talking to you. I know you're hiding something. I know you're lying to me. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a split second, I thought I might pass out from the sheer weight of it all. How did he know? How could he possibly know what I was hiding? My mind raced, but all I could manage was a weak, I'm not lying, Dad. It was the wrong thing to say. His expression shifted in an instant, turning from cold to angry. You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know when something's wrong? He slammed his fist down on the table, making the dishes rattle and sending a shock of fear through me. I've been patient with you, Lily. I've tried to give you the benefit of the doubt, but you're testing me. You're making me look like a fool in my own house. I had never seen him like this before. The calm, controlled father I had grown up with, who had always been there for me, who had always made me feel safe, was gone, replaced by someone unrecognizable. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and for a moment I thought he might lash out. My breath caught in my throat as I braced myself for whatever would come next. But then it happened. The floodgates opened. In that one moment of overwhelming emotion, I couldn't hold it in anymore. All the pain, all the fear, all the anger I had been bottling up for months came rushing out of me like a tidal wave. I can't do this anymore. I shouted, my voice breaking as the words spilled out. I can't keep pretending everything's okay. I can't keep pretending that you're the same man. You're not, Dad. You're not the person I thought you were. The room fell into stunned silence. My father stood there, frozen, his face a mixture of shock and confusion. I had never spoken to him like that before. I had never raised my voice, never dared to confront him with the truth of what I was feeling. But in that moment it felt like the only thing left to do. The silence between us had become unbearable, and I couldn't keep carrying it alone any longer. For a moment my father didn't say anything. He just stood there, his hand still gripping the back of his chair. Then slowly, he sank back down into his seat, his eyes never leaving mine. I saw something in his expression, something close to regret, maybe even guilt, but it was fleeting, gone as quickly as it had appeared. My mother, who had been sitting quietly throughout the exchange, finally spoke. Her voice was soft but steady. Lily, sweetheart, you don't have to carry all of this on your own. We're a family. We'll figure it out. But we can't keep living like this. We have to face the truth, all of us. And that was when I realized something. I had been waiting for the wrong person to face the truth. I had been waiting for my father to come to terms with his actions, for him to change, to apologize. But the truth was I had to face it first. I had to be the one to stop hiding, to stop pretending that everything was fine when it was far from it. That night, for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to feel what I had been holding back for so long. Anger, sadness, fear, and a deep sense of betrayal. And I knew deep down that I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep hiding behind silence, pretending that the monster in my house didn't exist. The breaking point had arrived, and in that moment I knew there was no going back. The lies, the silence, the fear. It had all built up to this point, and I couldn't carry it any longer. The truth was painful, but it was also the only way out. And for the first time in months I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could start to rebuild the life I had lost. For as long as I could remember, the house I grew up in was a place of comfort. It was filled with laughter, love, and the familiar smell of my mother's cooking that lingered in the air. But over the last few months, that familiar comfort had turned into a place of uncertainty and fear. The walls that once felt like a shield now felt suffocating, enclosing me in a reality I didn't recognize. It wasn't just the tension between my father and me. The changes in him had affected everyone, and the air in the house had become thick with suspicion and distrust. My mother, too, seemed a shadow of the woman she once was, her love for my father clouded by her own fears and doubts. I had never imagined that the people closest to me, the ones I trusted the most, could turn into something so unrecognizable. But as the months went by, it became more apparent that my father, the man I once looked up to, was no longer the protector he used to be. I tried to ignore it. I convinced myself that if I just kept quiet, if I just continued to play my role as the dutiful daughter, things would go back to normal. But the guilt weighed heavily on me, and the more I tried to bury it, the more the feeling of betrayal consumed me. What had happened to my father? How had he changed into this stranger, someone who no longer made me feel safe? It wasn't just the cold silences, the angry outbursts, or the unpredictable moods. It was the little things, the way he watched me when I wasn't looking, the way he seemed to be waiting for something from me, like I owed him something that I couldn't give. And then there was that evening, the moment that solidified everything. One late afternoon, my mother had asked me to help her prepare dinner. I was standing at the kitchen counter, chopping vegetables, when I heard my father's footsteps behind me. I didn't turn around immediately, thinking he was just passing by. But then I felt a hand on my shoulder. The touch was cold, unfamiliar, and the weight of it sent a chill through my entire body. I stiffened, hoping it was a mistake, hoping he would just move on. But his hand didn't leave. I slowly turned around, meeting his gaze. He was looking at me with those eyes I had once trusted but now felt foreign and unsettling. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in the way he stood so close, so deliberately close, that made my stomach twist with anxiety. "Why are you so distant lately?" he asked, his voice low and smooth, almost too calm. "Why do you avoid me, Lily?" I didn't know what to say. I couldn't tell him the truth that I was terrified. Terrified of what he had become. Terrified that the father I had known my entire life was slipping away and I couldn't stop it. Terrified that he wasn't the man I once trusted. "I'm not avoiding you," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just tired." "Are you?" he asked, his voice turning darker. "Tired of me? Tired of your family? I've been patient with you, Lily, but you need to understand something." He took a step closer, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my hands trembling as I clutched the knife in my hand. "You don't get to hide from me. Not anymore." I felt the blood drain from my face. I wanted to back away, to run, but the kitchen was small and there was nowhere to go. The air between us had become so thick, so heavy, that it felt like I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, my body frozen, not knowing what to do or how to get out of this situation. "I've done everything for you, for this family," he continued, his voice rising just a little. "And this is how you repay me? By shutting me out? By pretending like I don't exist?" I wanted to scream, to tell him how much I was hurting, to tell him that I was afraid. But the words caught in my throat. What would I say? How could I possibly make him understand? The truth was, I didn't feel safe anymore. Not in my own home. The man who had always been my protector, my father, was now the one I feared the most. I couldn't explain it to him. I didn't think he would even care to understand. He had already made it clear that I was failing him somehow, that I wasn't living up to whatever expectations he had set for me. I tried to move past him, to escape, but his hand shot out, gripping my arm tightly. "You don't get to walk away from this conversation," he said, his voice colder now, more demanding. I was paralyzed, my breath shallow, my entire body trembling. It wasn't just the physical touch. It was the sense of control he was trying to exert over me. The feeling that he wanted to dominate me in ways I couldn't escape. "Please," I said, my voice breaking. "Let go of me." But instead of releasing me, he pulled me closer. I could feel the heat of his body against mine, the sense of ownership in his touch, and the weight of the power he seemed to have over me. I felt like a captive in my own home, trapped in a situation I didn't know how to escape from. He let go then, but only after a long, heavy pause, as if he were testing me, seeing how far he could push before I broke. "I just want you to understand, Lily," he said, his voice softening slightly, but there was no mistaking the underlying menace. "I'll do anything to keep this family together. Anything." I nodded silently, my heart racing, but I didn't know what to say. How could I respond to that? How could I even begin to explain the fear that was building inside me? The deep, gnawing feeling that the man standing before me was no longer the father I had once known. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had shifted. My world, once so certain, so secure, was unraveling, and I didn't know how to hold it together. The betrayal wasn't just about what had happened between us. It was about the gradual, insidious transformation of a man I had once trusted, a man who had once been my hero, into someone I couldn't recognize. I couldn't protect myself anymore. I couldn't trust him to protect me. The weight of the lies I had been living, the silent suffering, was becoming unbearable. And for the first time I realized I had to make a choice, to continue living in fear, or to find a way to stand up for myself. The struggle to protect myself had begun, and I knew it was only the beginning. There comes a moment in every struggle where the weight of silence becomes too much to bear, and you realize that you can't face the battle alone anymore. For me, that moment arrived one cold evening, when I finally acknowledged the truth that had been gnawing at me for months, the truth that I was no longer safe in my own home, and the man who once protected me had become the very thing I feared the most. I had always been a proud person, never one to ask for help. Growing up in a small town, I had learned to do things on my own, to take care of myself and others. It was a way of life that had been instilled in me from a young age. But now, I found myself in a situation that I couldn't fix by my own strength or willpower. I needed help. Help that I didn't know how to ask for, but that I knew was crucial to my survival. It wasn't the first time I had thought about reaching out. There had been moments of fear, moments when I questioned if I could endure the pain any longer. But something always held me back. The shame, the guilt, the fear of what others might think. What would they say if they knew the truth? That I was trapped in my own home? That the man I had loved for so many years had become someone I couldn't trust? I feared the judgment, the pity, the whispers that would follow me. But the day I finally made the call, everything shifted. I had spent another day walking on eggshells, trying to keep the peace at home, pretending like everything was fine. But inside I was breaking. The emotional toll was unbearable, and I could feel myself slipping further away from the person I had once been. I had to do something. That night, after Julian had gone to bed, I sat in the dim light of the kitchen, my hands trembling as I held the phone. I stared at the numbers for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing with all the what-ifs and doubts. What if they didn't believe me? What if they turned it all back on me? What if I made it worse? But then I thought of the girl I used to be, the one who once believed that she could be strong, who could stand up to anything life threw her way. That girl was still inside me, buried beneath the fear and the shame. It was time to bring her back. I took a deep breath and dialed the number. 911, what's your emergency? The calm voice on the other end asked. For a moment I couldn't speak. The words seemed to get stuck in my throat. But then I heard the voice again, this time softer, more reassuring. Ma'am, are you okay? Can you tell me what's going on? I need help, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I'm scared. I don't know what to do anymore. The operator didn't ask questions, didn't hesitate. She just listened. And for the first time in months I felt like I wasn't alone. I told her everything, about the way Julian had been acting, the control, the manipulation, the fear that had taken root in my heart. When I finished speaking, there was a silence on the other end of the line. I held my breath, waiting for her response, half expecting her to tell me it wasn't serious enough to warrant help. But then she spoke with such kindness that I felt a small flicker of hope. We're going to send someone out to you, she said. Stay on the line with me, okay? I'm here with you. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. I don't remember much of what was said, only that I felt heard, and that in itself was a small miracle. Within what felt like moments, a police car pulled up outside, the flashing lights bright against the night sky. A gentle knock on the door followed. I opened it to find Officer Williams, a woman in her mid-30s with kind eyes and a calm demeanor. She introduced herself and stepped inside, her presence immediately comforting. She didn't rush me, didn't push me to talk before I was ready. Instead, she simply asked, "Can you tell me what's been going on?" I shared everything. how Julian's obsession with the store had grown, how his behavior had become erratic, how I had been living in fear for months. I told her about the threats, the emotional manipulation, and the growing sense that I was no longer in control of my own life. Officer Williams listened attentively, nodding along, her face soft with empathy. When I finished, she said, "You've done the right thing, Lily. You're not alone anymore." The next step, she explained, was to contact social services, to ensure that I had a safe place to go if things escalated. She talked to me about shelters, about resources available for women in situations like mine. It was hard to imagine leaving everything behind, to step into the unknown. But the more I listened, the more I understood that it was the only choice I had left. The following days were a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and meetings. Social workers visited our home to assess the situation, and they were the ones who confirmed what I had feared, that the emotional abuse I had endured was just as harmful as physical violence. They helped me understand that the control Julian had exerted over me was not just a series of isolated incidents but a pattern, a dynamic of power and manipulation that had been slowly eroding my sense of self. One afternoon, a social worker named Jennifer came to my house to help me with the next steps. She was in her late 40s, with short brown hair and glasses that gave her a sharp, professional look. She spoke with a quiet strength that made me feel at ease, and after listening to my story, she made sure I knew all the resources available to me. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, her voice steady. "You have support now. There are places you can go. There are people who will help you." I didn't fully believe it at first. The fear of leaving, of making the wrong choice, was overwhelming. But as Jennifer helped me gather my things and make plans for a safer future, I began to understand that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the first step toward regaining my life. The police had already talked to Julian, and though he denied everything, the officers were able to see through his lies. His intimidation, his attempts to manipulate the situation, were not going unnoticed. The support I received from both the police and social services was exactly what I needed to start the process of breaking free from the hold Julian had over me. It wasn't an easy journey. It wasn't a quick fix. But in that moment, as I looked out the window of my living room and saw the lights of the police car fading into the distance, I realized something. I had a future again. I had a chance to start over, to rebuild my life on my own terms. I learned that sometimes the hardest thing is asking for help. But in doing so, you open the door to a world of support, of resources, and of people who want nothing more than to see you thrive. Asking for help doesn't make you weak. It makes you strong enough to face what's coming, and to reclaim the life that's yours. In the wake of a tragedy or an emotional earthquake, things often don't settle in the way we imagine they will. We think there's a moment when the dust will clear, and we can go back to the way things were, before everything broke apart. But that's never the case. Sometimes the cracks in our lives, in our families, widen after the storm passes, and the consequences of those cracks can linger far longer than we expect. After I had taken the brave step of reaching out for help, after the police had been involved, after I had packed up and left Julian's suffocating grip, there was a period of intense fallout. I remember feeling overwhelmed by a wave of guilt, as if somehow I had betrayed my family by seeking protection. But the truth was clear now. I had to choose myself, even if it meant everything else would be disrupted. The first person I called after the police had left was my mother. I needed her to understand, to believe that I wasn't just making a rash decision. My voice trembled as I dialed her number, and I remember how heavy my heart felt as the phone rang. I was unsure of how she would react. "Martha, are you okay?" Her voice was warm and concerned, but I could hear the hesitation there. I'd always been the one who handled things, who took care of everyone else. This time it was different. I had to ask for help. "Mom, I don't know what to do. I need to leave him. Julian, he's not who he was anymore," I said, my words tumbling out like a broken dam. "I can't live like this anymore. It's not safe." There was silence on the other end. I could imagine her sitting there in the living room of her house, her hands folded in her lap. I had expected her to say something reassuring, something that would make me feel like I had made the right decision, but instead she hesitated. Finally she spoke. "Oh, honey," she whispered. "I don't know what to say. Your father, he's always been so proud of Julian. He always thought he was a good man. I just can't believe this is happening." Her words stung. Not because I was angry at her, but because I understood the depth of her disbelief. She wasn't blaming me, not directly, but her reaction revealed how the truth was breaking her as well. She wasn't just dealing with the knowledge that her daughter was in danger. She was facing the ugly reality that the man she had once accepted as part of our family was capable of such cruelty. I know, Mom. I know it's hard. I never imagined it would come to this either, I said, feeling my own guilt gnawing at me. But I need you to understand. I can't live in fear anymore. The phone call ended with promises to talk more later, but I could tell that the damage had been done. My mother, the woman who had always been my strongest support, was now caught in the same turmoil as me. She was torn between the love she had for her daughter and the love she still held for her son-in-law. In many ways, her reaction mirrored the confusion and guilt I felt inside. A few days later, when I spoke to Julian's family, the situation only grew more complicated. I wasn't prepared for the shame I felt when I explained to his sister, Lydia, that I had left Julian. Lydia had always been kind to me, but in the face of what had happened, her response was one of deep confusion. But why, Martha? What happened? He's not a monster, she said, her voice trembling with disbelief. He's been grieving just like you. You know how hard it's been for him since Oliver died. I tried to explain, but the words caught in my throat. Grief was no excuse for what had happened. For months, I had been the one to bear the weight of Julian's moods, his increasing obsession with the store, his threats and control. I had tried to justify it in my own mind, to tell myself that he was just coping with the loss of our son in a misguided way. But there came a point when that excuse no longer held water. I understand he's grieving, I said softly. But there are ways to grieve without hurting the people you love. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. I could hear Lydia's quiet sobs, and I knew this conversation was unraveling the fabric of the family's understanding of what had been happening. They had seen Julian as a hard-working man, a loving father, a devoted husband. They didn't want to accept that he had become something else. And perhaps I didn't want to accept it either, not fully. It was easier to see him as a victim of his grief, to excuse his actions for the sake of the life we had once built together. But the truth, when it finally broke through, couldn't be ignored anymore. I couldn't live in that lie, and neither could Julian's family. They began to question him too. They asked the same questions I had been asking myself for months. Was this the man they had known? Could they, too, see the change in him? And more importantly, could they accept that the family they had once known, full of love and laughter, had crumbled because of the dark, twisted hold he had over me? As time passed, the shame I had carried with me began to manifest in other ways. My friends, too, looked at me with confusion, sometimes even disappointment. I would hear whispers, questions in the grocery store, the coffee shop, or at church. I would smile, nod, but inside I felt like a stranger in my own community. I felt like a failure, like I had betrayed my family, my friends, and even myself. One afternoon, my old friend Doris stopped by. She had heard the news from a mutual acquaintance, and as soon as she walked through the door, she pulled me into a hug. I don't know all the details, Martha, but I want you to know that you're not alone in this, she said, her voice firm. This wasn't your fault. You did what you had to do. But even with Doris's kindness, I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. I had left Julian. Left him in his grief. Left him in a house full of memories we had shared for over 3 decades. I had chosen to leave the life we built together. And even though I knew it was the right decision, the shame weighed heavily on my chest. I couldn't erase the look on his face when I walked out the door that day. The mixture of disbelief, hurt, and anger. The look that said, "How could you do this to me?" But in the days that followed, I realized that this was no longer about him. It was about me. It was about finding my voice again. About reclaiming my life and my sense of self. The conflict inside me, the guilt, the shame, the fear was part of the process, but it didn't define me. The shame I had felt slowly turned into clarity. I wasn't running from my past. I was building a future. One where I could breathe freely without fear. It was time to accept that the family I had known was forever changed. But that didn't mean I had to stay buried beneath its weight. I could build something new one step at a time. The guilt still lingers, of course. It always will. But I have learned that healing isn't a linear process. It's messy, painful, and full of setbacks. But it's also a journey of strength, resilience, and above all, grace. And that's something I can carry with me, even on the darkest days. Sometimes it feels like the hardest thing in the world is not just surviving the past but finding the strength to leave it behind. There's a strange comfort in familiarity, even when that familiarity is wrapped in pain, regret, and the heavy weight of unresolved emotions. For years I had lived in a world where I had learned to endure, silently, passively, hoping that things would get better if I just held on long enough. But there comes a moment, a turning point, when you realize that holding on only keeps you tethered to a past that's no longer serving you. For me, that moment arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly. I had been living in the same house, walking the same streets, breathing the same air that had once felt like home. But now everything had changed. Every room, every corner, every item in the house seemed to carry memories of Julian, the man I had loved, and yet had become someone unrecognizable, someone I feared. The house, once filled with laughter and love, now felt like a prison that held me in a past I couldn't escape. As the days went by, I realized I couldn't stay there any longer. It wasn't just the memories that haunted me. It was the constant reminder of what had happened to us, to our family. There were too many reminders. Oliver's absence, Julian's obsession with the store, the painful decisions he had forced me to make. And worst of all, the constant feeling of betrayal and fear that had taken root in my soul. Leaving was never going to be easy, but I knew it was the only way to truly move forward. I had spent so many years adapting to others' needs, to Julian's control, to the expectations of a life that I never fully chose for myself. It was time to reclaim my own agency, my own life, and find a place where I could breathe again. But leaving meant more than just walking out the door. It meant breaking away from everything I had ever known. It meant confronting the guilt I felt for abandoning my husband, the man who had been my partner for over 30 years, even though he was no longer the man I knew. It meant finding the courage to say goodbye to the life I had built, to the house, to the store, to the memories of my son that lingered in every corner. I remember the night I decided to leave. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't filled with fireworks or a grand speech. It was a quiet decision, made in the stillness of my own heart, in the privacy of my own thoughts. Julian had been out late at the store again, and for the first time in months, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, staring at the empty space where Oliver's toys used to be. I could almost hear his laugh, his voice calling for me to come and play. But that laugh was gone, replaced by the silence of grief that had swallowed our home. I knew then that I couldn't stay in this limbo anymore. I had to go. The next day I took small steps. I started packing my things. Nothing extravagant, nothing dramatic. Just the essentials. A few clothes, my books, my mother's old recipes, and some of the small items that had once made our house feel like home. I didn't want to take everything, just enough to start over. I couldn't carry the weight of all those memories with me, not all at once. When I told my sister Lucy about my decision, she was both relieved and worried. "You've been talking about leaving for months now, Martha," she said, her voice soft but insistent. "You've got to do it. You deserve peace. You deserve to be free." But there was a part of me that was still torn. How do you walk away from someone who was once your everything? How do you leave behind the man you married, the man who shared your life, your hopes, your dreams? The man who had, for so long, been the person you leaned on? But it was that very man who had become a stranger to me. The Julian I had once known, the one who made me laugh, who danced with me in the kitchen, who told me everything would be okay, was gone. In his place stood a man consumed by obsession, control, and something darker I couldn't identify. And in the face of that, I had to make the hardest decision of all. To leave him, to leave the life we had built together, and to finally choose my own future. I left that morning while Julian was at the store, quietly slipping out the door. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't have the words, and in truth, I wasn't sure how to leave without shattering what was left of my own heart. My heart ached as I walked out of that house for the last time. I wasn't leaving out of anger, but out of necessity. I moved into a small apartment in downtown Portland. It wasn't much, but it was mine. It was a place where I could start over, where I could breathe without fear. It was a safe space, where I could find myself again after all the years of losing parts of who I was. In those first few weeks, I did something I hadn't done in years. I spent time with myself. I took long walks by the river, I sat in quiet cafes with a good book, and I allowed myself to feel things again. Things I had buried under years of control and manipulation. I didn't know what I was going to do next, but I knew I had made the right choice. One evening, as I sat on the small balcony of my new apartment, looking out over the Portland skyline, I realized that leaving wasn't just about escaping Julian. It was about escaping the woman I had become under his influence. It was about rediscovering who I was without him, without the store, without the expectations of a life that no longer served me. I wasn't just leaving the past behind. I was rebuilding myself piece by piece. I knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still painful memories to confront, and there were still scars that would take time to heal. But I had taken the first step, toward freedom, toward peace, toward a life that was truly my own. Leaving the past behind isn't just about putting distance between yourself and the things that hurt you. It's about finding the courage to reclaim your own story. And in that moment, I realized that the story I had been living wasn't mine anymore. The life I had lived with Julian was a chapter one had closed, and now it was time to start a new one. Healing is not a straight line. It's not something that can be easily measured or predicted. After years of living in the shadow of grief, betrayal, and fear, I was finally free. But freedom, as I quickly discovered, isn't the end of the journey. It's just the beginning of a new chapter. It was in the quiet moments, those moments when I was alone with my thoughts, that I began to understand the depth of what I had lost, and more importantly, what I could still find within myself. At first, the idea of moving forward felt like a distant dream. The weight of the past was heavy, pressing down on me in ways I hadn't fully realized until I was no longer distracted by the busyness of life. The days were slow, each one stretching out in front of me like an open road, but it wasn't the road I had hoped for. It was a road full of uncertainty and pain, and the idea of walking it alone, without the man I had spent over 3 decades of my life with, seemed like an insurmountable challenge. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I started to see things differently. It wasn't just the loss of Julian and our son that I needed to heal from. It was the loss of myself. For years, I had lived under the weight of Julian's expectations, his control, his plans for our future. I had sacrificed pieces of who I was to fit into a life that was never truly mine. But now I had a chance to rediscover myself. And it wasn't going to be easy, it wasn't going to be quick, but it was going to be real. I began by doing small things that I had never had the time or freedom to do before. I took long walks around Portland, rediscovering the streets I had once known, but this time with fresh eyes. I spent quiet afternoons at the local cafe, reading books I had put off for years, letting my mind wander to places that had been neglected in the rush of my old life. I took up knitting, a hobby my mother had taught me as a child, and found a quiet sense of peace in the repetitive motions of the needles. The simple act of being alone, without the constant presence of Julian, without the weight of expectations, was incredibly healing. For the first time in years, I could think without fear. I could listen to my own voice and I could follow my own heart. There were moments when I would stop mid-walk and feel a wave of sadness wash over me, remembering the life I had left behind. But even in those moments of sorrow, I felt something else. The slow, steady pulse of hope. For the first time in a long while, I felt the possibility of something different. Something better. Of course, there were still hard days. Days when the grief would come rushing back like a tide, threatening to pull me under. On those days, I allowed myself to feel the sadness, to cry if I needed to, and to acknowledge the pain that would never completely disappear. But I also learned to take those moments in stride, knowing that healing was a process, and that it was okay to have setbacks. It didn't mean I was failing, it meant I was human. One of the most important things I did in those first months was rebuild my relationships with the people who had been there for me throughout it all. My sister Lucy had been a constant support, even when I couldn't see the way forward. She had offered me refuge when I was too afraid to leave, and she had stood by me through every moment of uncertainty. I started calling her more often, checking in with her, letting her know that I was okay, even when I didn't feel like it. Our bond grew stronger as we shared not only memories of our childhood, but the hard truths of what I had gone through in the past few years. I also reconnected with old friends I had lost touch with when Julian and I became more isolated in our world. Some of them had heard the rumors, others had heard nothing at all, but it didn't matter. They welcomed me with open arms, no questions asked. In their company I found laughter again. I found a sense of normalcy that I had forgotten existed. But it wasn't just my relationships with others that needed rebuilding. It was my relationship with myself. I had spent so many years thinking that I was defined by my marriage, by my role as a wife and mother. But now I had to redefine who I was without those labels. It was a scary process but also an empowering one. I took long moments to sit with myself and ask, what do I want? What do I need? I had spent so much time focusing on what others needed from me that I had forgotten to ask these questions. But now I had no one to answer to but myself. And slowly I began to build a life that was truly mine. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't easy, but it was authentic. I started volunteering at a local charity for women, helping others who had faced the same kinds of struggles I had. I found fulfillment in giving back, in being a source of support for others who needed it. It gave me a sense of purpose that I had longed for, and it allowed me to channel the pain I had experienced into something positive. The more I embraced this new life, the more I realized that healing wasn't just about moving on from the past. It was about learning to live again, to breathe again, and to find joy in the small things. I learned to cook for myself, to bake the bread my mother had once made, and to fill my home with warmth even on the coldest days. I didn't need Julian's approval to feel worthy. I didn't need his legacy to validate me. I was enough just as I was. In the process of healing, I also learned to forgive not just Julian but myself. I had spent so many years blaming myself for the failures in our marriage, for not seeing the signs earlier, for allowing myself to be controlled for so long. But the truth is, I had done the best I could with what I had known. I had survived, and that was something to be proud of. I still had days when I felt like the pain would never end, but I also had days when I felt the lightness of hope, like a new dawn after a long dark night. I had taken the hardest step of all. I had left the past behind, and I was rebuilding my life piece by piece. The healing wasn't instantaneous, but with every day, I felt a little stronger, a little more whole. And though I didn't know what the future held, I knew one thing for sure. It was mine to shape. I was no longer defined by the man I had married, the grief I had endured, or the life I had left behind. I was Martha Wilson, a woman with a past, but a woman also with a future. And that future was waiting for me to claim it. It's often said that time heals all wounds, but I've learned that time doesn't necessarily heal. It teaches. It's what you do with that time that makes the difference. After everything I had been through, I finally found myself standing at the threshold of a new beginning. It wasn't a moment of grand clarity, no sudden epiphany that made everything fall into place. Instead, it was a quiet realization, one that came gradually, almost imperceptibly, that I was no longer just surviving. I was beginning to live again. In the years that followed Julian's death and the aftermath of our troubled marriage, I found peace in the small things. I used to think that happiness meant grand gestures, big moments of celebration. But now I realized it was found in the everyday acts of self-care, in the moments where I could simply be. I learned to appreciate the comfort of my own company, the sound of my own voice, and the stillness of the mornings when the world was just waking up. At first, peace felt elusive, like something I could never quite grasp. But as I took one step forward each day, no matter how small, I realized that peace wasn't something I had to chase. It was something I had to cultivate within myself. I didn't need to seek it from others or from the past. I just needed to be present with my own story. That story was mine, and I was the one who would decide how it unfolded. In the beginning, I found solace in routine. The daily rhythms of life, simple as they were, helped me feel grounded again. I spent my mornings walking to the local coffee shop, greeting the barista who always asked how my day was going. I would sit by the window sipping my coffee, watching the world pass by. It was during these quiet moments of reflection that I began to realize how much I had been holding on to, how much of my energy had been spent clinging to the past. And it was time to let go. Letting go wasn't easy. In fact, it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. I had carried so much with me for so long. The anger, the bitterness, the resentment, that I didn't know where to start. But one day, as I sat in the park, watching the children play and the ducks swim in the pond, I felt something shift. I looked around and realized that the world was still beautiful, despite everything that had happened. And I was still a part of it. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of the past lighten. I knew that it wasn't just the passage of time that had healed me. It was the choices I had made to move forward, to choose peace over bitterness, and to choose joy over sorrow. I realized that I wasn't defined by the events of my life. I was defined by how I responded to them. One of the most empowering moments in my journey was when I began to reclaim my sense of self-worth. For so long, I had been defined by my relationship with Julian. I had been his wife, his partner, his caregiver. But now, I was learning to see myself as something more, something greater than just the woman who had been in a troubled marriage. I was Martha Wilson, a woman who had lived through pain, but who was now finding her strength. This realization didn't happen overnight. It came in small moments of courage, in the quiet voice that told me I was worthy of love, of respect, and of happiness. It came in the form of standing up for myself, whether it was setting boundaries with people who drained my energy, or simply saying no when I didn't want to do something. I began to understand that my happiness didn't depend on anyone else. It was within me all along. I also began to see that empowerment didn't just mean standing strong in the face of adversity. It also meant asking for help when I needed it. For so long, I had thought that asking for help was a sign of weakness. But over time, I learned that it was actually a sign of strength. I reached out to my friends, my family, and even professional counselors who helped me untangle the mess of emotions I had been holding inside. Each conversation, each therapy session was a small victory in itself. As I continued on this journey of rebuilding, I found myself embracing new opportunities. I had always loved to sew. My mother had taught me as a child, and it had been my passion for years. But in the years of being married to Julian, I had put that part of myself on the back burner. Now I was returning to it with a newfound sense of purpose. I began making quilts for local charities, using the very skills that had once defined my sense of self-worth. Every quilt I made was a symbol of my healing, a tangible representation of the strength I had found within myself. Eventually, I even started teaching quilting classes to women in the community. It was a way for me to give back, to help others find the same sense of empowerment and purpose that I had found. And it felt good to know that the pain I had experienced could be channeled into something beautiful and meaningful. It was a way of honoring my own resilience while helping others to recognize their own. I also realized that empowerment wasn't just about doing things for others. It was about giving myself the space to enjoy life. I started taking short trips to places I had always wanted to visit. I spent weekends in the countryside, taking long hikes and enjoying the quiet beauty of nature. I even joined a book club, where I made new friends and discovered new stories that inspired me. Each of these experiences was a reminder that there was still so much life left to live, so many moments yet to be had. As time went on, I found that peace didn't just come from what I was doing, but from who I was becoming. I was no longer the woman who lived in fear or doubt. I was no longer the woman defined by the tragedies of her past. I was a woman who had taken back control of her life, a woman who had found her voice and was no longer afraid to use it. Now at 79, I look back on everything I've been through with a deep sense of gratitude. The pain, the loss, the suffering, all of it shaped me into the woman I am today. And while I would never wish for the things I've experienced, I know that I am stronger because of them. I have learned to embrace the fullness of life, with all its joys and challenges. Healing is an ongoing process, one that requires patience, grace, and the willingness to confront your past. But it is possible. And I hope that, as you hear my story, you are reminded of your own strength. You are worthy of peace. You are worthy of love. And you have the power to rebuild your life, no matter how many pieces it may seem to be broken into. Keep moving forward, and remember that a new beginning is always within reach.